So there we go. You should have received a notification that we're recording today's session. So welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Dear Editor, which is the Research Medical Library's ongoing conversation series about scientific writing and publishing. So today I'm joined by Joe Munch, and we're going to be talking about AI and its use in scientific papers. So if you are joining us today, you've probably heard of AI, and specifically, I suspect that you have heard of ChatGPT. So that is what we're going to be talking about this afternoon's session. One other housekeeping thing I wanted to say is we are recording today's session, and you will be able to access the slides, and we also put together a handout with some of the resources that we're talking about this morning, and you'll have access to that after today's session. Okay, so if again, as I was saying before, if you joined us this morning, you've probably heard of some of these text generating AI software, and specifically, you've probably heard of ChatGPT. So what we're talking about today is called large language model based chatbots, and basically, large language model chatbots work by using machine learning algorithms. So basically, they're trained on this big database of human-generated text. And what they do is they go through this big database of text, come up with patterns in the language, and then when you input some sort of prompt, the chatbot can process its text and then use its model to generate a response. In other words, it finds the most likely text that matches whatever you input and then spits that back out at you. So that's a really, really basic description of what this software is and how it's working. I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to tell you anything more specific than that. But basically, that's what's happening. It looks at a bunch of text, you give it a prompt, and it spits something back out at you and says, here's what you asked for. So it's fascinating technology, and there's been a lot of buzz about it. Since ChatGPT was launched in November, it's generated, and in some cases, literally generated a lot of headlines. So I'm curious, for people who are attending today's session, has anyone here used ChatGPT? And if so, how often? So I'm going to launch a poll for this. There we go. And I see already some people have jumped in. Okay, so some of you have not used it, but there's a few of you that have. So I'll give everybody a couple more seconds to respond to this poll. Okay. 2 more seconds. All right. So there we go. So you can see even a number of people watching, attending this session this morning or this afternoon, have actually used this software. Some of you have used it a lot every single day. That's interesting. 3 to 5 times a week. Wow. So yeah, it's out there. This technology is available and people are using it. And I don't think it's going to go away. Okay, so let's go on to see what I'm talking about. Lots of buzz, lots of headlines, and in some cases, it's literally generated its own headlines. So most of the articles that you see here are from peer-reviewed journals, scientific journals, and that's really what we're going to focus on in talking about ChatGPT today. A lot of these are editorials, commentaries, letters to the editor, that kind of thing. People obviously have some opinions about this software, and they have a lot of questions about it, just like we all do. So we're trying to understand what this is, what it can do, what it can't do, how it can be used, and in some cases, maybe whether it should be used.
Right, and you see, I was just going to mention from those headlines, you can see there's kind of 2 facets that we'll talk about today. And the first facet is kind of this, what are the ethical questions that people are asking? And they're asking a lot of ethical questions. So that's kind of going to be the launching point for our discussion today.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, if you start looking at some of these, there's kind of a common thread. A number of them are asking whether ChatGPT should be considered an author. So to answer that question, it's worth looking back at what constitutes an author in a scientific paper. This is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE, authorship criteria. There are 4 of them. MD Anderson's authorship policies are based on these as well. So these probably look familiar to you. An author is somebody who contributes to conception or design of the work, drafts the work, has final approval, and agrees to be held accountable for the work. So most of the journals that we're seeing that are talking about this technology have taken the stance that essentially ChatGPT and that type of software cannot be considered an author, especially because of this 4th point, it can't be held accountable. So to look at some examples, Science takes a fairly hard stance on this and says text generated from AI shouldn't be used in its papers or any generation of content. And it can't be considered an author again. You're going to start seeing that thread a lot in these author instructions that we're presenting here. Kind of similarly, Nature takes a little bit different stance. Says yes, it's not an author, but if you use large language models like ChatGPT, you need to properly disclose that you used it and describe it in your methods section like any other research tool. So of course, the implication here is you can use it, you just have to make sure that you say that you used it. Journal of the American Medical Association, here's what they have to say. Again, authors take responsibility for the integrity of their content. And what they say here is they discourage its use, but again, don't outright ban it. So we're getting a little bit of different stances from these journals. But again, we're starting to see these common threads that the software isn't considered an author, it's considered a tool. So I think that's kind of the common thread that we're seeing here. Also sharing this one from Elsevier, again, saying authors should disclose their work, and AI-assisted technologies aren't considered an author. But technology can be used to improve readability and language of the work. So this is kind of where the state of things are, just from 4 examples of some journals and a major publisher. This is just sort of a snapshot of where the scientific publishing world is right now on the use of this technology. And I should have said earlier, this is a quickly evolving technology. So what we're saying today is true today, might not be true in a year, might not even be true in a couple of months, but this is where we are right now. So we just kind of wanted to give you a snapshot of that. This article, this is another editorial in accountability in research. And here these authors point out that another potential ethical consideration with using the software is the potential for plagiarism of not just text, but also some of ideas. And that's a concept that we're going to come back to a little bit later on, showing you some demonstrations of how the software works. So that's another point to consider with when it comes to using the software, particularly for scholarly publishing. And again, so World Association of Medical Editors, last one I'm going to share with you as far as what people are saying. This one, reiterates that chatbots can't be authors and you should disclose its use and so forth. But this group also points out that editors may need tools to detect the use of this AI-generated text, which is kind of another interesting point. And in fact, there is already software in development that can do this. OpenAI, which is, I believe, behind ChatGPT, has a tool of its own that it's creating, as well as Turnitin, which is the maker of Authenticate that we use at our institution, is a plagiarism detection software. But Turnitin is also developing software to detect AI-generated text as well. So those tools are being developed right alongside the tools that are used to detect plagiarism. So it's a changing field, and there's a lot of things happening and somewhat quickly. But that's just kind of a general snapshot of where scholarly publishing is right now with dealing with this new technology. So it's not that it's not going to be used, but there's some careful considerations to take when using it in this context. All right. So I'm curious also to hear from you again. So a number of you said that you've used this software I'm curious what you've used it for, and I don't have a poll for this. You can type your answers in the chat here. It's okay. Outlining looks like. Silly poems. Yes, it is a fun tool for anything that's of a creative bent for sure. Okay, code, interesting. Generating ideas. Just playing around, email. Interesting. So one person says not a native English speaker, and it helps to make it more clear. Okay. Yeah, so it does have a lot of uses, and it's certainly out there as we see. So I'm going to turn this back over to you, Joe, because I think you did some experiments with ChatGPT, and I'm curious. I think we should share the outcomes of those.
Right. And someone just made the point that you can't trust the references. And that's something we're about to go over. So the first part of this conversation has been about kind of these ethical questions we have about ChatGPT. And there we go. So tons of ethical questions about whether really it should be used, and if so, how, and to what extent do you have to credit it. But the other side of that is some of the practical implications. And that's the other kind of thing that's been emerging in the literature about ChatGPT. So even doing a PubMed search for ChatGPT, and I did this a week or two ago and came back with 125 results. And a lot of those are about what are some of its fallibilities. And I think you can search this today and get over 150. So people are continuing to kind of probe it for its capabilities. So sorry, the slides are advancing a little slow for me. So the main thing to keep in mind whenever using ChatGPT is its limitations. And there are significant limitations. And if you've been following the story, the many facets of the story in the news, you'll see that it can go off the rails is one of the terms I've seen a lot, where it just starts kind of, going off the rails. It starts talking about something else entirely. It shows its bias, or it just shows complete ignorance of a topic. And that's in part because, as Erica mentioned, this isn't like a Google search. It doesn't collect current information necessarily. It builds its responses word by word based on an algorithm. And so occasionally, because it's fed all this information from the internet, some of that information is not necessarily correct or gets rearranged in an incorrect way. You get a kind of a false answer when you query it. It can also have a bias, or it can produce harmful instructions, again, because it's just following its algorithm. It's not making kind of those sentient decisions that humans make when they're deciding whether to put something in the writing. And because it's not connected to the internet, it was trained on internet information, but it's not connected to the internet. And that training stopped in 2021. And that means that it doesn't have any knowledge of the world, or very limited knowledge of the world, after 2021. So if you were to ask it, for example, who won the World Series in 2022, which I think we all know the answer to, it would not be able to tell you truthfully what that outcome was. So to probe some of these limitations, I played around with ChatGPT myself. And the first thing I did, among many things, was to ask it to write an introduction section for a manuscript describing a phase 2 clinical trial about the efficacy of, was it pembrolizumab and radiotherapy in TNBC patients. And I cribbed that idea from a published article. So that information was already out there. In fact, the article was published before 2021. So just to give it a fair shot, presumably ChatGPT was even trained on some of the information in this article. So I gave it this query and I got this response. And it's not really impressive. it starts off with your basic generalized information about breast cancer and triple negative breast cancer, things that are pretty fairly well known. So it doesn't have a whole lot of specifics here. And it doesn't go into a deep background about, what, why they did this study or why the study was warranted or any of those things. And then it even goes on to give, it kicks out these findings, which are just absolutely made up. They talk about an overall response rate of 60%, which, oh my God, congratulations on your Nobel. And overall survival of 6.2 months and 12.9, it's just completely made up stuff because, again, it's just generating that text word by word. So my point that I want to illustrate here is that you're not going to be able to use ChatGPT to spit out a section of your manuscript, at least not in its current iteration. Even the kind of the souped up version that they came up with or put out just a week or two ago, the GPT-4, which has allegedly capabilities above and beyond what the original version released in November has. But you're not going to be able to sit down with ChatGPT and write a basic query like this and have it do your work for it, have it do your work. But to give you an idea of how you might use it, I also did this. And this time I queried it with the same basic instructions, except I added some caveats. So I asked for details, I asked for supporting references, and I asked it to give a rationale. So not just give me an introduction section, but actually give me one that provides a rationale. And you can see that the result is a much more detailed, in-depth introduction section. It's not perfect. It still has limitations. It still would probably have to be tailored to a journal and probably have to be tailored to your study if you're doing such a study. But you can see how it can give you a fairly good rough draft. Even that said, though, there are still some things you have to watch out for. Now, someone here already made the point that it can give false references, and that's absolutely correct. So it did give me references, and I used I think the newer version of ChatGPT. So they update ChatGPT, and then they have GPT-4 and all this. But I used an updated version of ChatGPT, and actually it gave me a better example than what I got with the original ChatGPT. But it did give me references here. And as I reviewed these references, and they're not shown here, but I got the full bibliography. 12 out of 13 of them were correct. They were actual real references. And so this was, it was surprising, but it was also a little heartening. So, okay, we're on the right track here. But as I got into these references, problems became clearer. So, for example, I could pull up my notes here since I'm not sharing my own slides. So, so the main problem here is that although these references are real, they're not necessarily the kinds of references you would cite or that a person would cite when building an introduction section. So reference 6, and this is given to support the drugs use in TNBC. But it's actually, this reference is actually about another combination therapy entirely. So it's not about pembrolizumab and radiotherapy. It's about another pair of drugs. So citing that reference would be entirely erroneous in this case. Reference 10 is the non-existent one. It's the one that I couldn't verify. It doesn't exist, so it's utterly worthless. And so would be any information behind it be. 11 through 13, which are given in support of the ICIs and the radiotherapy, include, and this is for ICIs in melanoma, non-small cell lung cancer, renal cell carcinoma. But if you look at these references, these 3 references, together they account for only 1 patient with renal cell carcinoma and no patients with melanoma or those other cancers. And so again, it's an unhelpful tool in this respect because it's citing references that would not be cited for that information. And then the other main point is that the references that it did cite, about half of them were at least 10 years old. And in some fields, that can be a real problem because information travels relatively quickly. Research moves along fairly quickly in some areas, and you really can't get away with citing archaic references in some of your fields. So this this is just to emphasize that although you can get a workable text with AI generating programs, you have to verify everything. And as Erica said, you have to be able to take responsibility for the content. And if you're citing the incorrect references, a knowledgeable reviewer, is going to pick up on that and ding you for it. So if you do use ChatGPT, be aware that it's got these limitations and that it's not just it's not just going to spit out what you want it to. I think we had a quick question, actually kind of a long question in the chat. Okay, I don't know quite what to make of there. Doesn't seem to be a question, but something for y'all's consideration. So ChatGPT works a little better if you provide it with your own information. So again, using this previously published article available online, it was open access, so that information is already out there. I asked it to paraphrase a passage from the article. And remember that paraphrase is a retelling of the essential facts in a different, essentially in different phrasing. And it returned something fairly respectable because you can see that the data are identical in the highlighted portions. So the ORR matches, the 95% CIs match, the rates of progressive disease, and the number of patients who were assessed for radiographic response. All those things remain the same. So it does work a little better when you provide it with your own information. Now that can be extended. So if you might envision this as being, you need some help summarizing, or you need some help paraphrasing. I'd say it's not a perfect paraphrase because it does, there is some places where you can kind of track the new text alongside the old, and that would be problematic. So even though it does do a halfway decent job of this, it doesn't do a perfect job of it. So anything that ChatGPT gives you back will have to be kind of reviewed carefully, not just for content, but also whether it kind of fits those definitions of acceptable publishable material. And one other limitation that is kind of buried, it isn't mentioned explicitly in the limitations on that launch of ChatGPT, but in its I believe it's in its terms of use or policies. But because it can build similar text for similar queries, there's a real possibility that you could have it build a block of text that's going to match something that somebody else had it build. So it's important to not only check that text for content, but check it against Authenticate or something to make sure that it's not already out there. So you could use this feature to paraphrase, you can use it to summarize, you can even use it to proofread or even edit your text. It does have some drawbacks there as well, but the main caveat here is that you shouldn't share your data with it. And that's because they even ask you if you play around with ChatGPT, there's some FAQs and so forth. It says explicitly, don't share sensitive information with ChatGPT. That could be, of course, personal information, name, address, phone number, social security number, names of kids, dogs, cats, whatever. But that can also be patient information, right? And so it could be patient information. It could be information that's specific to your manuscript, specific findings to your manuscript, basically anything that you don't want other people to know about unless you give them permission. And so what they do with that information is they use it to help refine that model. But, a nefarious player could certainly take that information and make use of it or what have you. So the caveat is don't share sensitive information with ChatGPT. And we're going to go ahead and end the conversation with this. And that's that ChatGPT and other AI programs were mentioned in the last research town hall in February. Dr. Dryeta spoke briefly about it, and I'll include the link to his video in this handout that I'll share shortly. But basically, and you can see some of the headlines here that were on one of those first slides. But basically, MD Anderson currently doesn't have a explicit policy about using ChatGPT or similar models in writing. Dr. Dryeta says that there's a task force that will come together and make some decision on that. But in the meantime, his advice is to avoid using it for writing scientific research papers, but to go ahead and play around with it to kind of, just do what I did, just see what its capabilities are and how it might be fit into your workflow or research. So that's about it. Of course, we're happy to answer any questions you have. And I've shared a handout with all the links to all the articles mentioned here. If you're really interested in figuring out kind of what's happening with ChatGPT in scientific publications, just search it on PubMed. You'll have a laundry list of articles to choose from. So we have
Okay, so someone's
Carrie Cameron
asking to yes, come back with this topic again. I think that's a great idea. I think we should revisit this periodically, just for exactly the reasons we talked about. It keeps changing. So yeah, what is going to happen? Are we all going to end up in a hall of mirrors? It's a great question. There does seem to be that possibility. I don't think when you run these texts through plagiarism checkers right now, I'm not sure that we don't, as far as I know, Turnitin hasn't launched their AI detection software yet. At least we don't have it, unless someone else has heard something different, but I think that is in the works.
It is in the works. And of course, it's the one thing, I didn't run anything that I generated through Authenticate, which is the one thing I didn't do, of course. I did try ChatGPT's, I don't know if they're calling it the beta version or what, but I did try ChatGPT's detection tool. And I used the text it generated and it came back with a low probability of it being AI generated text. So what they have right now is probably imperfect. There are so many questions surrounding AI, and we're trying to cover just a very thin slice of the pie here, because it's something that, if the headlines are to be believed, is going to become endemic in our lives, even more so than it already is. So I like the idea of revisiting this every so often, because it's going to be an evolution, and it's going to be kicking up all kinds of other questions, especially when you consider the fact that 6 months ago this technology existed in a nascent form but wasn't what it is today. So who knows what we're going to see in another 6 months. It could be something that that actually, the references are real, the bias has been eliminated, the information has been checked. So yeah, it's going to be something that I think would be worth revisiting. And I'm interested to hear what the task force at MD Anderson comes with. I suspect, just from what I've read in all the journals, with the exception of science. And I think science really is the outlier. It seems that most publishers have accepted that this is going to be a thing that people use. And you can certainly see the utility of it because it does do an awful lot of work, especially if you're an inexperienced writer, especially if you don't have a whole lot of time on your hands. And it'll be interesting to see what the ethical boundaries of its use are. Can you use it to help generate your ideas? Do you have to acknowledge it if it helps you generate those ideas? Clearly, it doesn't. It can't be listed as an author currently, but could that change?
Someone in the comments here mentioned implications for the development of critical thinking, as researchers. So yeah, there's lots of implications here for sure. And it looks like one of, I was just noticing that one of our neighboring institutions apparently says don't use it right now. So there we are. Yes, we are going to share a link to the slides, the recording, and we have a handout with some of these references, these citations that we mentioned and showed you examples of on the slides today. So yes, we'll be sharing that after the meeting. Were there any other questions? Okay.
Great.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat right now. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And yes, I think that's a fantastic idea. We should come back and revisit this topic again in a few months because it's gonna keep changing.
You might not even need to be here. We'll just have ChatGPT do the whole thing.
Yes, we'll have we'll generate our entire presentation using software.
Oh, here's a good comment, I think.
Okay.
It's dangerous to use scientific data in this platform. As scientists, we understand that all new data published is something that needs to be often reviewed. Maybe in the future, articles may be protected from this kind of platform research. Yeah, good point. That kind of ties in with the warning about sensitive information. Can we use ChatGPT to develop the search strategy of a review? That's an interesting question because in my what little research I did for this, it wasn't that little. I kind of fell into a few rabbit holes, but a couple people have actually tried that. They tried to have it generate research articles, find me all these research articles for, this or that topic. And as we've mentioned, the research articles that came back were bunk. They were just non-existent. So right now, if you're looking to just identify research articles for review, your better bet is to actually go to the research medical library and ask for some assistance there. And someone mentions that they could not access I'm guessing the ChatGPT website. I had the same problem forever and eventually just hit it right and was able to create an account and log in. And I can say that even now they've been having some issues with, you can save your conversations. So let's say you're having a conversation, which is such an interesting term for talking to a computer, but so you can save your conversations about, you'll say you have a conversation about writing an introduction section, you have a conversation about writing a review, you can save those. But currently they can't display them, and they're working on that problem. So ChatGPT isn't without its hiccups either. Yeah, it does. It's going to take a couple tries to create an account. But since I've created an account, I've had no trouble logging in.
Where can I join future webinars? The best thing to do is join our team, the Dear Editor team, and we'll announce upcoming sessions and that sort of thing there. The Research Medical Library also has its own calendar of events. Let's see. And thank you, Sunita, put up a link for if you want to set up a consultation for literature search with librarian. Yes, our website has that as well. All right.
Well, and I would just, for those of you who have hung on, I would just say this: it is well worth. I think it's well worth your effort and time to familiarize yourself with, if not ChatGPT, then some of the other similar tools out there. Because I think, from my standpoint, seeing its capability, kind of envisioning what I could use it for, it seems like this is going to be a powerful tool in writing and publishing. That's not to say you should use it right now, but you should be familiar with its capabilities.
Yes, image generating tools. That's like a whole other discussion.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Right, and thank you to everyone for attending. I'll go ahead and stop the recording, I think, at this point.